I am somewhat of a B650 motherboard enthusiast, I think. Gee, it's a bit sad, isn't it? Anyway, let's not focus on that too much and instead pretend that testing the VRM thermal performance of 56 motherboards, all using the same chipset, is a totally normal thing to do. And being that it is a totally normal thing to do, you'll want to know which B650 boards are worth buying and which ones you should steer clear of. But before we get into that, today's sponsor spot is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly and their CryoSheet graphene thermal pads, which are an excellent alternative to thermal pastes. They offer very high thermal conductivity with no liquid components, so they can't dry out and therefore don't degrade over time like pastes and even liquid metals. CryoSheet is very easy to use, it's extremely durable, and is available in a range of sizes to suit most applications. I've personally done some high-end GPU testing with CryoSheet, and the results were impressive, very similar in fact to that of liquid metal, but without the mess, and of course, no risk of drying out. So for more information, please check the link in the video description. Okay. So today we're updating my B650 VRM thermal database, and I guess we can call it that now. We will be adding 15 new models, or at least models that we hadn't previously looked at, and that means I've now tested a grand total of 56 motherboards. And all of that data will be updated and featured in this video. Some of the new boards have been heavily requested by viewers, such as the Asrock B650 Steel Legend Wi-Fi, so the non-E version, the MSI Pro B650-S Wi-Fi, and the Gigabyte B650 Eagle AX. Anyway, as usual, there is a lot to go over, so let's get into it. Let's start by taking a look at the new Asrock B650 Steel Legend Wi-Fi. And while you might think we've already covered this board in our previous B650 content, that was the B650E model. The new B650 non-E version looks fairly similar, though it is based on a cooler looking, and I mean aesthetically, white PCB. The VRM is still very powerful though, moving from a 1660 amp power stage V-core to a 1480 amp power stage V-core, and you still get some nice big heat sinks. In terms of pricing, it's just $20 US cheaper than the B650E version, though oddly this new non-E version seems to be a B650E board in disguise maybe, offering PCIe 5.0 support for the primary PCIe x16 slot, along with a PCIe 5.0 M.2. In fact, when compared to the B650E version, you're getting many of the same features. In fact, some features have been improved, such as the Realtek ALC 4082 codec, additional PCIe 4.0 x 1 slot, and more USB options. Stuff like the I/O shield is still pre-installed, there's heat sinks for all three M.2 slots, and the chipset gets a nice big heatsink as well. Overall, the B650 Steel Legend Wi-Fi is a great looking motherboard and should be a serious contender in the sub $200 US price range. The Asrock B650E Taichi Lite is in my opinion one of the most exciting B650E motherboards, and I'm still having a bit of a hard time believing that you can buy it for $240 US. That's because this is essentially the original B650E Taichi motherboard, which currently costs $370 US. So that's $130 US more, which is an over 40% premium. And that's pretty crazy because the Lite version is essentially the same board, but without many of the RGB effects and fancy heatsinks. The board still packs ample cooling though, and there are some RGB effects, but honestly, who cares? For $130 off, they can keep the damn RGB crap. This is a seriously good board for the money. There's 24 105 amp power stages powering just the V-core, so that's a rather insane VRM. There's loads of USB ports, PCIe 5.0 expansion and M.2 slots, good quality audio, and basically everything you could possibly need. The I/O panel comes with a pre-installed shield. There's a dozen USB ports, including a USB 4 Type-C port. So this is an incredibly well-equipped board and probably the best featured board below $300 US. Now, time for some new Asus motherboards, and I'm not exactly sure when the Prime B650M-A AX6-CSM Wi-Fi was released, but the last time I took a look around, which was a few months ago now, I didn't come across it. Now, what I did do is request a review sample from Asus, but they told me they didn't have access to a sample for this particular model. They just couldn't do it, guys. Too exclusive for this one, it seems. The truth is, though, it's a heap of junk. Without question, one of the worst B650 motherboards that I've come across, so spoiler, I guess. Just don't buy this motherboard. The board uses X semi-discrete MOSFETs of the XPG4064C and XP4062C variety, creating a very weak 4-phase V-core. There's also barely any cooling to speak of, just a small silver heatsink over the V-core MOSFETs. Now, it's not currently on sale in the US, but you can buy it here in Australia, and most have it priced around $270, which is what I paid, but there are now a few listings as low as $240 Australian. And that's still really expensive for this type of motherboard. The equally terrible Asus Prime B650M-A Wi-Fi 2, for example, that costs $180, while a decent board, such as the MSI Pro B650M-A Wi-Fi, can be had for $200. Pricing aside though, this is one of the worst, if not the worst, B650 board I've come across when it comes to reliability. Getting the board just to post was a challenge, and it was unable to run stable using our G-Skill Trident Z5 Neo DDR5 6000 CL30 memory, and when it did post, our stress test would crash after a few minutes, forcing us to test the board without Expo loaded. Features-wise, it's nothing fancy either. You get 4 expansion slots, which I guess is nice, though you will probably only be able to use a few of them as they're all crammed together on this MATX board. There is a PCIe 5.0 enabled M.2 with 2 more 4.0 slots, a reasonable amount of USB ports, Wi-Fi 6, though you are only getting Gigabit LAN. So all in all, not a good motherboard, so let's just move on to see what else Asus has for us. The B650 Tough Gaming models were impressive in our previous testing, and we now have the new E versions, whereas the previous models were designated as Plus. For this standard ATX model, we're saving $20 when compared to the Tough Gaming B650 Plus Wi-Fi, so that lands this board at $180 US. This discount sees the V-Core VRM cut down from a dozen 60A power stages to 8, though the PCIe slot, M.2 and SATA configuration remains the same, and there's the same total number of USB ports. Networking has been changed. You're now getting Wi-Fi 6E rather than just Wi-Fi 6, but the 2.5 gigabit LAN has been downgraded to gigabit, so that's disappointing. The cut down E model also misses out on the M.2 heatsink for the second and third slots. The SATA ports are less conveniently placed. There's one less PCIe times 1 slot. There's just a single USB Type-C on the I/O panel rather than 2, and the integrated audio has been downgraded. In my opinion, a 10% discount really isn't that much for what you're giving up here, but also I guess it'll depend on what your feature preferences are. The good news is the VRM should still work well, so overall probably not a bad product. And it's a similar story with the Micro ATX version, the Tough Gaming B650M-E Wi-Fi. It should cost around $200, and I say should because availability isn't great right now. The Tough Gaming B650M Plus Wi-Fi is priced at $210 US, so $10 more than the full-size ATX model, which is a bit odd. You'd expect the smaller board to be a bit cheaper. Again, this model packs 8 60A power stages for the V-Core VRM. You get 3 PCIe 4.0 slots, a PCIe 5.0 M.2, and another 4.0 M.2. So the same configuration as the more expensive Plus model, though the second M.2 slot doesn't come with a heatsink. There's a similar number of USB ports, 4 SATA ports, and this time you are getting Wi-Fi 6, just like the original, and it even keeps the 2.5 gigabit LAN. If this new E version does end up just $10 cheaper than the Plus, then I don't really see the point. Just spend the extra money to get the better board. It's a trivial price difference at this point. Okay, so let's take a look at the new MSI boards, and we'll start with the Pro B650-S Wi-Fi, as this is one that many of you have been asking me to check out, probably because it is very cheap for a decent looking ATX B650 motherboard. Priced at around $145 US, it's one of the cheaper models out there, but sadly for the VRM it doesn't utilize power stages, rather discrete MOSFETs, though there are quite a few of them making up a 12-phase V-core. There's no PCIe 5.0 support to speak of, which is probably fine. Most of you won't need that, certainly not at this price point, and there are 3 PCIe slots in total, though just a pair of M.2s. There are 11 USB 3.2 ports, which is a lot, and just 4 USB 2.0 ports. You also get Wi-Fi 6E and 2.5 gigabit LAN. Sadly though, there is no pre-installed I/O shield, so it feels a bit cheap in that regard, though for many of you this probably is only a minor detail, so really it's going to come down to how well that VRM performs under load, and of course we will look at that shortly. Now another new board is the MSI B650M Gaming Wi-Fi. In fact, this one's so new that it's not even listed for sale yet over in the US, though you can buy it here in Australia for $220 AUD, so 12% less than the Pro B650-S Wi-Fi. But this might be another B650 board that you possibly want to avoid. Of course, we will have to test it. It does only feature a 6-phase V-core using Cinebench discrete MOSFETs. Of course, if you're using a Ryzen 5 or Ryzen 7 processor, this sort of power delivery should suffice, though there are already a number of MATX boards in this price range that can handle the Ryzen 9 7950X, such as the Asrock B650M PG Lightning Wi-Fi and Gigabyte B650M DS3H, for example. When compared to the Asrock B650M PG Lightning, the MSI board packs an inferior VRM, one less M.2, and fewer USB ports. And here in Australia it costs $20 more. So unless this MSI board drops at less than $150 US, it appears to be dead on arrival. There's also the MSI B650M Gaming Plus Wi-Fi, which oddly also costs $220 AUD, so here in Australia, and it is a much better looking board. Firstly, the V-core has been upgraded to a 10-phase design, which will help greatly with VRM performance. You also get an extra PCIe slot and 3 more USB 3.2 ports. The second M.2 slot also features a heatsink, and the I/O panel gets a pre-installed shield. And there's twice as many USB 3.2 ports on offer. It is a much better product, so I'm not sure why it costs as much as the non-Plus version here in Australia. I guess we'll have to see how that one plays out. Overall though, a decent looking MATX B650 motherboard, and I hope it can handle the Ryzen 9 7950X. Now, the MSI B650 Gaming Plus Wi-Fi is an interesting board. Priced at $170 US, it has a lot of competition as a standard ATX model. The new Asus Tough Gaming B650E Wi-Fi, for example, that competes here, as does the new Asrock B650 Steel Legend Wi-Fi. There's also the excellent Asrock B650 Live Mixer, which costs just $150, though that board does look quite outrageous, I guess you could say. But if that's a bit too leery for you, then the slightly more expensive Gigabyte B650 Gaming X AX may suffice. Now, most of these competing boards feature excellent VRMs using 60 amp or better power stages, but the B650 Gaming Plus Wi-Fi uses discrete MOSFETs, though at least the V-core uses a 12-phase design, so it should be half decent. Still, it is going to struggle against the likes of the Asrock B650 Live Mixer, which packs 14 60 amp power stages for its V-core. You also get an extra M.2 slot, one of which supports PCIe 5.0 bandwidth and many more USB ports. Though it is worth noting that the MSI board includes Wi-Fi 6E, but it also costs $20 more. Frustratingly, there's no pre-installed I/O shield, but overall it is a decent looking motherboard, so I guess we'll just have to see how well it tests. Now, another motherboard that many of you have been asking me to test is Gigabyte's B650 Eagle AX. Again, because it's another affordable ATX model, currently priced at $140 US. So this model is really designed to combat MSI's Pro B650-S Wi-Fi. Like the MSI board, you're getting a 12-phase V-core using discrete MOSFETs, though they're the crappy onsemi 4C10N and 4C06N MOSFETs. Gigabyte has strapped on a big old heatsink covering all the VRM components, and you also get a nice pre-installed I/O shield, so they've done better than MSI in both of those respects. You're also getting better PCIe expansion, better M.2 support, with 3 in total, one of which is a PCIe 5.0 compliant slot, though there are just half a dozen USB 3.2 ports, which is nearly half that of the MSI board, so a bit disappointing there. It seems instead Gigabyte's gone quite heavy on USB 2 ports, offering 3 times as many at a dozen. The wide networking has also been downgraded to a gigabit connection, so some real disadvantages here when compared to the MSI board. So, assuming that the boards perform well in our VRM thermals, I think MSI might actually have the better board, as I prefer the 11 USB 3.2 ports opposed to just 6, but that will of course depend on your own personal preferences. Overall though, it is a decent looking board for $140 US. Okay, so a neat little MATX board that I recently came across is the Gigabyte B650M Aorus Elite AX Ice. And unfortunately, this model is yet to go on sale in the US. But again, we can buy it here in Australia, though it does cost around $330 AUD, which should place it at around $200 US. Now, any Gigabyte motherboard with ICE in the name is a white motherboard. Not necessarily an all-white board, but it should have a white PCB with silver heatsinks. Most of the connectors, though, are black, so it's more of a black-white design. It is a well-equipped board, though, packing 12 60-amp power stages for the V-core portion of the VRM. You also get 2 PCIe x16 slots and 2 M.2 ports, one of which is a PCIe 5.0 compatible port. There's also 11 USB 3.2 ports and 8 USB 2.0 ports, along with Wi-Fi 6E and 2.5 gigabit LAN. The board is lathered in heatsinks, with a massive heatsink over the VRM components. You also get a pre-installed white I/O shield, and there's loads of USB ports here with 12 in total. Here in Australia, it is priced to compete with the MSI Mag B650M Mortar Wi-Fi and Asus Tough Gaming B650M Plus Wi-Fi, and in terms of features, it is remarkably similar to both. Now, the Gigabyte B650 Aorus Elite AX was, in my opinion, a best-in-class product, beating out the MSI Mag B650 Tomahawk Wi-Fi and Asrock B650 Pro RS. Today it costs $200 US, but we have a new version, the V2, which is coming in at $185 US, so it's a small 15% discount. On the surface though, they appear to be the same motherboard, which I guess makes sense, but even when you compare their specs, everything looks pretty much the same. The key difference though with this V2 is to the VRM, which has been reduced from a 14 70-amp power stage V-core to a dozen 60-amp power stages. So still a very strong VRM, but it also is quite the downgrade. The thing is though, this board should still run very cool, as truth be told the original was overkill in that respect. The new $185 US price tag also makes the V2 cheaper than the Asrock B650 Pro RS, so that better positions it as a mid-range contender. When compared to the Pro RS, you're getting an extra PCIe slot, an additional 4 USB 3.2 ports, and Wi-Fi 6E, whereas there's no wireless networking of any type on the Asrock board. So on paper, the B650 Aorus Elite AX V2 looks great, and I can't wait to test it out. If you like the Gigabyte B650 Aorus Elite AX V2, but you wish you could get a white version, well, you're in luck, because that's exactly what the B650 Aorus Elite AX Ice is, for an extra $15, so the same price as the original B650 Aorus Elite AX. But what this means is you get the same 12 60-amp power stage V-core VRM, 3 PCIe slots, 3 M.2s, 11 USB 3.2 ports, Wi-Fi 6E, and 2.5 gigabit LAN. So it's not quite as good as the V2 in terms of value, given it does cost a bit more, but it is the best ATX B650 motherboard that's white, so I guess it wins that category by default. Now, if you want a B650E version of Gigabyte's B650 Aorus Elite AX Ice, then you can get that with the B650E Aorus Elite X AX Ice. Far out, these are getting tricky. For $230 US, you get the same dozen 60-amp power stages for the V-core portion of the VRM, but with this model, the primary PCIe x16 slot is 5.0 compatible because it's an E-board, and that's pretty much it, with the exception of a few cool RGB effects and better looking heatsinks. And some of those heatsinks do feature quick release clips, so that's a nice touch, I guess, but in terms of VRM performance, they should be very similar. Then lastly, we have the Gigabyte B650E Aorus Pro X USB 4, which isn't on sale or even listed yet in Australia or the US. So I have no idea how much this model is set to cost. Now, when it was available, the B650 Aorus Pro AX, that cost around $250 US, but that model seems to be a bit redundant now that the B650E Aorus Elite X AX Ice has landed for $230 US. So the B650E Aorus Pro X USB 4 is the best Gigabyte B650 motherboard to offer USB 4 support, and prior to that, the only B650 boards to actually include USB 4 support was the Asrock B650E Taichi and the Taichi Lite, both of which only offer a single port. So in that sense, this new Gigabyte motherboard is a big deal for those of you wanting USB 4 support. Of course, with no idea how much it costs, it is difficult to say just how excited you should be. It's also the first B650 motherboard to include Wi-Fi 7 support, and with 16 80-amp power stages to the V-core, the VRM is again overkill to the point that anything more extreme really doesn't matter for the AM5 platform. Of course, I will test it anyway, and we'll just have to wait and see how much it costs. Speaking of testing, we do have a bit to go over, so let's get into it. For testing, I'm using the Height Y70 Touch tempered glass case, and for cooling, the Arctic Liquid Freezer 360mm ARGB AIO. Then for recording temperatures, I'm using a digital thermometer with K-type thermocouples, and I'll be reporting the peak PCB temperature. Finally, I'm not reporting delta T over ambient, instead I maintain a room temperature of 21 degrees, and to ensure a constant ambient temperature, a thermocouple is positioned next to the test system. As for the stress test, I'm using the Ryzen 9 7950X, and for load Cinebench 2024, which was looped for an hour, at which point I'm reporting the maximum PCB temperature, again recorded using K-type thermocouples. These results aren't comparable with past B650 results for multiple reasons. For example, we're using the latest AGESA code, new hardware with the case and cooling, and updated software for creating load. That said, I have retested every single B650 board for this video, so let's get into the results. Here's our random batch of new B650 motherboards, and overall, some pretty great results here. The new Tough Gaming models ran at 67 degrees, which is just a degree higher than the original Tough Gaming Plus models, and we'll compare those shortly. Of course, as expected, the Aorus boards all performed exceptionally well, as did the Taichi Lite. The Gigabyte Eagle AX is also a solid option for the price, as is MSI's Gaming Plus Wi-Fi. The standard MSI Gaming Wi-Fi did struggle hitting 112 degrees, though amazingly we didn't see any throttling issues with the Ryzen 9 7950X, so really this motherboard will run all other AM5 processors with ease, and the same is also true of the Pro B650-S Wi-Fi. The only model to fail our testing here, due to throttling, was the Asus Prime B650M-A AX6-CSM Wi-Fi. It quickly reached over 100 degrees, and by the time it hit 110 degrees, it started to throttle the CPU down to 545 MHz, with the end result being a 10% performance loss after a 10-minute loop of that Cinebench multi-core test. Now here's a look at all 56 B650 motherboards that I've tested, and thankfully the vast majority of them work just fine with any AM5 processor. Now please note, you don't need to buy a motherboard with the lowest VRM thermals. As long as the bar graph is coloured blue, it's a pass. It doesn't matter if the VRM ran at 50 or 80 degrees, the end result for you is going to be the same. So beyond a pass, it comes down to the features and price. So in a sense, we're just validating these boards with a pass or a fail and not ranking them in some kind of order. It's really not until we get right down to the bottom of our graph that we find the bad boards, the boards that you should avoid. And while it's true that all of them will work fine with a Ryzen 7 or Ryzen 5 part, in the vast majority of cases it makes absolutely no sense to buy these boards as they don't offer any additional features or a better price point than competing models that passed the test. As an example, the Gigabyte B650M Gaming Wi-Fi, that costs $150 US, and it failed our test miserably, throttling the 7950X so aggressively the performance was reduced by 35%. Meanwhile, for $160, you could buy the MSI Pro B650M-A Wi-Fi, which ran at under 90 degrees and scored over 50% higher in Cinebench. The MSI model also offers more PCI expansion, more M.2 slots, significantly more USB 3.2 ports at 11 versus 4, and Wi-Fi 6E versus Wi-Fi 5. So for $10 more, it is a far better product. But there's also much cheaper options worth considering, such as the Asrock B650M HDV/M.2, which costs just $120 US, though availability seems to have dried up right now. Asrock did tell me at Computex that after our original video went out demonstrating just how good the B650M HDV/M.2 is, that they haven't been able to make enough of them. Apparently it's outsold all other motherboards combined. So take note of that, board makers. Produce affordable, quality motherboards, and you will generate significant demand. Pretty obvious, isn't it really? So there you have it. There is now 10 motherboards that you should avoid, as there are better options available for a similar price. And again, look, I know it's true that all of these boards should work well with something like a Ryzen 7 7700X, and certainly a Ryzen 5 series processor. And if you never plan on upgrading beyond a 105 watt part, then I guess that's fine. It doesn't really matter which board you get, but I personally would prefer the freedom to install whatever Ryzen CPU I want in the future without having to potentially upgrade my motherboard if I want to extract the full performance from that CPU. After all, AMD has now officially extended AM5 support to 2027 plus, which should mean Zen 6 processors will also be supported, and possibly even a 4th generation, though that seems a bit unlikely at this point. But the point is, if you buy a decent AM5 motherboard now, chances are you'll be able to keep it for a very long time. So as it stands right now, looking over at a retailer such as Newegg, the cheapest B650 board worth buying is the $130 US Asrock B650M Pro RS, as the $120 Asrock B650M HDV/M.2 is out of stock. Now, the outright cheapest board though is the MSI Pro B650M-P at $110, and that is a truly awful product. It has a hard 135 watt power limit for its VRM. So in my opinion, the Asrock B650M Pro RS is well worth spending the extra $20 on, regardless of what CPU you plan on buying. The Asrock board also offers better PCI expansion, an extra M.2 slot, one of which supports PCIe 5.0, 2 more USB 3.2 ports, a pre-installed I/O shield, significantly better power delivery coupled with better cooling, and the primary M.2 slot also comes with a heatsink. But best of all, you can throw any AM5 processor on the Asrock B650M Pro RS, and it will handle it with ease. Just finally, as a side note, I have got my hands on every single AM5 mini ITX motherboard, and we'll be doing a roundup of those boards shortly. So for those of you who missed the ITX boards in this video, just know that one is coming. I also have a complete B650 buying guide in the works. A look at all the best options at every price point, so stay tuned for that. For now though, we are done here. If you enjoyed this content, please do give it a like, because it was a stupid amount of work. I don't know why I do this, but for some reason I find it somewhat interesting. So, and you guys seem to as well, so I guess that makes it all worth it. We do have Floatplane Patreon, so you can check out either one of those if you want to support the channel more directly. Again, we do spend a tremendous amount of money on this testing because a lot of these boards we can't get sampled, so we do have to buy a lot of them, and some of them the manufacturers just, they don't want to send because they know they're, what does Tim say? Stinky dog poo, something like that. They're not good, I guess, is what Tim means by that. But yeah, Floatplane Patreon, Discord, live streams, behind the scenes content, Q&A stuff. That's all very cool if you're interested. But if not, that's perfectly fine. And I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve. See you again next time.